Everyone. Welcome to the IntraCultural podcast, the inaugural edition. I'm Missy.
I'm Lucy, and we're two anthropologists that co-founded Willing Observers, a DEI firm that focuses on culture.
So, the IntraCultural podcast covers a range of topics and answers common questions that can be better understood using the concept of culture. Today, we'll do some introductions and then focus on the topic that you cannot escape here or anywhere, American politics. We'll address an important question: how do I talk to my cousin at dinner if they have different political views?
So, before we do that, a brief introduction so you know who we are and what we say and how we say it. So, first of all, quick disclaimer: Missy and I cuss a lot every so often. So, if that is not your jam, then we are very sorry. We don't know what to tell you. Second, I have cats. There's one right behind me, and there's another one roaming around. So you might think I am a cat lady, but they're just really needy. Let's see what else. So as I mentioned, we are anthropologists. I received my degree from UC Irvine back in the day. I did my dissertation on diversity professionals, seeking to understand how how do they create this thing called diversity, equity, and inclusion as a business practice. So I was trained by DEI professionals since 2012, and now I am one myself. What else? My background, I am Mexican heritage, so that will come up oftentimes in the podcast about how I live my life in this way and how that informs my practice and even my relationality with Missy here. And what else? Currently, I am based out of Arizona, so I'll pass it on to Missy.
Hi, everyone. So I am in Long Beach, California. I don't have any cats roaming around behind me, but I do have a lot of wild squirrels running around in front of me outside who are also very needy, but in a different way. So my background complements Lucy's background. I have a checkered academic past and have degrees in a lot of different things: political science, linguistics, English literature. And I got my PhD in anthropology, and I studied how people talk to each other about politics in ways that feel empowering instead of disempowering. So today's topic is definitely my bread and butter. But a lot of the work that I do in political spaces, I also apply in doing DEI work and thinking about how people communicate across difference and how we think about and build inclusive cultures. So the thing about me that will probably come up over and over again too is that I am originally from Western Pennsylvania, that I grew up in a very small town, and that I am a first generation college student. So,
Yes. Oh,
um,
so am I. And Missy, we should tell people that DEIB stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, in
yes,
case people did
in,
not
ca-
know that.
in case we get to this point and they're like, oh, it's a firm that does a thing. So, very, very
We are two people, the firm of two people.
Yeah, perfect. So, I think that's all we're going to tell you about us at the moment, but I'm sure other things will come up as we move on. But let's talk a little bit about how to talk to your cousin at dinner if they have different political views. So,
Yes. Missy
yeah.
has this problem. I thankfully do not have this problem because I am Mexican, as mentioned 5 minutes ago. But I know a lot of Mexicans do have this problem. It's just not my family currently.
No.
So Missy, how do you talk to your cousin at dinner if they have different political views?
Well, I think that this has become an increasingly common problem, right? We all have somebody in our lives who has different political views, and you sit down at the dinner table, and I think that historically, there's a lot of politeness and white politeness that goes on where you say, "Oh, mm, that aunt, that uncle, that cousin, we just can't talk politics at all because then that will, right, disrupt the family dinner and disrupt our relationships. Um, and I don't do that.
Mhm.
Instead, I actually have those conversations. So why do we need to have those conversations, even if it seems like they're disruptive? Well, you don't
And
actually go ahead.
sorry, one thing that I was going to say is I don't know if you remember in 2016, the last time Trump was up for election, this was all over the news, right? Like NPR did an episode on how to talk at the Thanksgiving table about politics. And everyone was talking about this because for the first time in a long time, people had divided families. And one of the things I would like to mention that Missy didn't, but like Missy comes from a very working class, and that also shapes how you talk about and what you talk about and you don't talk about when it comes to politics, because the white civility of not talking about politics in my as far as I know, it has to do with middle class, upper classness, right? Not necessarily working class. Because in
Mhm.
my family, we argue and talk about politics all the time. It's like part of our daily existence. But so this might be different for different families, but having the tools that you've been working on for a long time is useful for anyone, regardless of whether it's a Trump versus non-Trump or a anarchist versus socialist conversation.
Yeah, any conversation where there's division and like these divisions are happening in my family in different ways around the dinner table for, pre-Trump, right? Um, my veer into like feminist theory probably sparked some of it. And but it creates tension. And this idea that you shouldn't talk about it is problematic because you just don't have a healthy relationship if there's this big outstanding thing that you just avoid and you can't talk about at all. And so you have to actually develop the skills to have conversations across difference and have conversations about these kinds of contentious things. And in politics, right, which has become increasingly contentious at the same time that in certain spaces people have like started to talk more and more, right, to people who agree with them and become kind of more vocal and more invested in these kinds of political topics and political identities. But then you talk less to the people that are actually right, in your family that you care about. And you need to be able to
Mhm.
have those conversations or like, what kind of relationship do you have if you just have a big part of your life you can't talk about?
Totally. And I know, and the talk that we're having today draws a lot on a training that you do for engaging in political conversations. And one of the things that you say in those trainings is that we have different identities now based on who you vote for. So if you vote Democrat, you identify as being a Democrat, which means that, as you mentioned in the last training, because I was sitting there like a fly on the wall, was that it's not just, you don't just expect to vote on one issue and agree on one issue, but now because you're a capital D Democrat, you're expected to agree with everything. And how that shapes your identity, and to your point, creates further and further alienation to the point where you can't even talk to your family members if you see them as being a different kind of person than you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that means my training is super impactful because you remember that. Haha, right?
Yeah, I did. I was taking notes.
Yeah, but, that's, absolutely true. You have an identity as a certain, right, political party, and that's, like, the core of your identity, and then if you deviate from the platform of that party, then you're somehow not a real Democrat or a real Republican, and so that kind of identity work becomes really important for thinking about this division because, um, one of the big things that happens in addition to that kind of identity work is that you have different media spheres, you're talking to different people, you get different ideas about what's happening in the world and the baseline of like reality, but also different baseline assumptions. So I'm going to give you one of the examples that I give. to think about, right, how this development of baseline, different baseline assumptions impacts the way that you can have conversations with people, or it's something that you really need to address if you do hope to have conversations. And that is, right, so nonsense example, but if your cousin sits down at the table and says, "Oh my goodness, the monster under my bed has fangs." How do you respond if your cousin sits down at the table and says that to you? I don't
This
know.
is a real question for me. How would I
Oh, yeah.
respond?
How do you respond if your cousin sits down and says, "Oh my goodness, the monster under my bed has fangs"?
How old are they?
Mm, 25.
Oh, oh, that's how I would respond. I would just start laughing. Um, but seriously, if they're 25 and they say monster under my bed has fangs, think how would I say? To be honest, I feel like I would ignore them. Like what kind of comment is that? Like I don't think I would even engage in it unless they were watching a TV show. I would assume that they're watching a TV show, or I would assume it's not their actual voice that's talking, or maybe that they're talking to a child. But I would not take it seriously. Let's put
Yeah,
it
and so here's your, like, nerd moment, right? This is, uh, Rita Paul Grace, right? This idea that, like, the people around you are trying to communicate, and so you usually give people a lot of leeway in trying to engage, like, you're trying to figure out, like, what are they doing? What are they saying? Because there is this kind of inherent need, desire, want to actually communicate with other people and to assume that they're trying to communicate with you. Um, and they are. And so if they sit down and say, "The monster under my bed has fangs," right? So the first thing that you need to do, whether it's this or some, right, political conversation you get into, is try to figure out what are the baseline assumptions that they have that might differ from the baseline assumptions that you have. And in this case, it's very clear, right? Maybe Lucy, you're like, monsters, right? Monsters don't exist. But obviously they think that they do. And
Yeah.
if you can't start from that point, then or get at why, right? Or what the baseline assumptions are, then you're never going to be able to move beyond that. And if you're not cognizant of it, you just get stuck in this kind of cycle of fighting about something that you're not sure what you're fighting about because you're just coming from different, sets of assumptions.
And I'm trying to think of something like a political conversation where I have felt that way, where it's like, why do I even talk to you? Or what are you even saying? And a lot of time this happens around like immigration, right? All immigrants are illegal or all Mexicans are illegal. If someone just told me all Mexicans are illegal, I'd be like, what? Like,
Right.
I think I would similarly not respond or maybe even laugh and then just not engage because I would not even know where to begin.
Yeah. And that's, it's hard to deconstruct those very different, right, baseline assumptions or views of the world. And so, your goal should not necessarily be to immediately try to move that, right? But to
Mm,
understand that this person is operating from a reality where monsters exist. And they told me this because they want to talk about the monster having fangs. And I need to hear them out and understand what they're trying to say. And I know that they're operating from a different baseline assumption than I am. But instead of getting mired down in that kind of, circular attempting to immediately convince somebody that monsters don't exist if they believe that they do, then it's a better tactic to kind of just listen, right? To let them to start asking them questions and be like, "Oh, tell me more," right? So that
yeah.
you can get a sense of where they're coming from because you're not going to be able to connect with them in any way if you don't understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. So a couple things are happening for me as you're talking. One of them is that when you're with family members, sometimes you don't want to do the work of listening, right? You just want the conversation to be easy. Because I'm thinking, when you're saying that, would I engage this person in conversation? And my first instinct is to not engage the person in conversation. Then it just feels like work to do so. And I do engage people in conversation as part of my DEI professional job, right? That is, I'm in that role of I have to understand you. But with family members, sometimes we treat them worse than we would our own colleagues. So then we're not in that space. So that's one thing that's happening for me. The other thing is this, what you just said, don't try to move them and convince them that monsters are not real. In the same way, we could just easily get into a back and forth of that's not true. Yes, that's true. No, that's not true. Right. But going back to the example that I gave about all Mexicans being illegal or something like that, I could easily see myself just arguing facts on this, trying to get them to move on their position. So you're saying don't do that.
I'm saying don't do that in the initial pass, right? To
Mm,
actually, if you want to move someone's position, it's frustrating, but it usually takes multiple contacts and lots of time. And trying to hear them out about where they're coming from and their baseline assumptions is the first step to actually attempting to connect with them and potentially move them in a
yeah.
direction in the future.
So what are the assumptions here? What are the baseline assumptions under monster has fangs?
All right. So I say the monster under my bed has fangs. So the baseline assumption, the clear baseline assumption on one side is monsters are real,
Hmm.
right? Monsters live
Yeah.
under my bed.
Mhm.
And the surprising thing is it has fangs. Oof, let's talk about the fangs, right? On the other
So
side,
you want to talk about the fangs.
I want to talk about the fangs, right? Because
Got
I
it.
am like, oh my goodness, this monster that's been living under my bed forever. There's a new one. It has fangs. Um, but we
And
never
I'm like, you've lost it. We're not having this conversation.
Because you're coming from the baseline assumptions that they don't exist. And so I think part of the frustration that happens in having political conversations is that one person wants to talk about the fangs, right? And then you just end up going back to like this
Yeah.
exchange of potential right facts that about monsters, the existence of monsters, and it just right? It
Yeah.
goes nowhere and then everyone gets really frustrated. And that's part of why that disjuncture happens over and over again with political conversations.
Yeah. So continuing my example, if it was all Mexicans are illegal, someone might be thinking that all Mexicans that illegal, the problem of being illegal is the issue. And I'm trying to argue with them that no, there's plenty of Mexicans that have been here since before it was the US.
Mhm.
And then so they're trying to have a different conversation than the one I'm trying to have based on the word choices that they picked.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, maybe in that context, like, so whether we're talking about monsters, right, or we're talking about an actual, right, political conversation, the next step I would take is just ask open-ended questions and let them talk. And that
Mm,
can be hard, especially when it's a really difficult conversation, but
mhm.
asking open-ended questions and saying, "Oh, well, tell me more about the monster," or "Why do you think that?" or "When was the first time you saw the monster?" And like getting people to talk openly, if you can,
Yeah.
is a really good way of really understanding where they're coming from. And the more people talk, the more that they start revealing things not only about their view, but um, talking in a way that you can start picking up, right, by actively listening on, things that you still share or still have in common, uh,
Yeah.
even if you diverge on that particular point.
Or even just a simple question of what do you mean?
Mhm.
Sometimes, I teach a microaggression, micro inequity training, and sometimes people are like, "How do I even?" Oh, that will be a topic for a different podcast. So if you don't know what that is, I will not get into it right now. But some people are really curious, like, how do I intervene, or what do I say when someone says something offensive or something that makes me feel excluded? And sometimes it's just a question, "What do you mean?" What do you mean by that? Like, can you say more? And then that really helps you get to where people are coming from your point, what assumptions they're making, what is their intention,
Mhm.
which, and helps you find some kinda common ground to have a conversation.
Absolutely, and getting them to tell stories is usually the best way. So, and, what do you mean is good? Saying, "Can you tell me about a time when," or, "Can you tell me about the first time?" Usually gets them to tell potentially a story, and the more that people love to tell stories about themselves, right?
Mhm.
We all love to do that, and so the more you can get them talking, the more that you can really actively listen and start, figuring out not only their reasoning and their kind of views and their baseline assumptions, but you can really start picking out points where you still overlap, you still have things in common, and that's the place where you want to initiate the conversation. Even if your end goal is to move them away from believing in monsters, you're not going to get there unless you can find a way to connect.
Yeah, I love that. And it also brings up the, really important point of having empathy, right? And wanting to actually know what the other person is saying and understand where they're coming from. And sometimes we don't care about that, to be completely honest. Sometimes we just don't care enough to have this conversation. But that's why we brought up the example of the cousin, because it's someone that you care about, someone that you have a connection to, someone that you do want to understand from their perspective. Like, what are they trying to tell you? And we can talk a little bit more about that, but it reminds me of, I do a lot of nerd reading on relationship things. And the Gottmans, the Gottman Institute, they have this thing where it's like bids for connection, right? People feel connected when you just care about the thing that they care about and that you respond to it. So my original response of laughing at the person who says, my cousin who says the monster has fangs, like that it would be absolutely the wrong thing to do. That would not be a bid for a successful bid for connection. But just, just thinking, and one of the examples they give is, it's like, "Oh, look at that bird. It looks so nice." If you just turn and look at the bird, that person instantly feels connected to you. But if you just ignore it, you're like, "Ah, I don't care about the bird," then that creates further alienation and disconnection.
Yeah,
So I
and
can definitely see how this, feeds into that.
absolutely, and we're saying it's hard, right? This doesn't it is work, right? So this doesn't mean you need to approach every stranger on the street, right, and have a political conversation or invest like your time and energy, but you do have people in your life you need to talk to. I'm more willing to go out and just like find the random person on the street. And here's an interesting political example. I had a neighbor uh, when I lived in West LA that came over to our house to give us something that I think it was a package that was misdelivered. And I started talking to him, and he started telling me all about the what was the conspiracy theory with like Hillary Clinton and Comet Ping Pong.
Pizzagate?
Pizzagate, yes.
Uh-huh.
So he starts telling me all about Pizzagate, and but I used to hang out at Comet Ping Pong. Like, I used to go there for trivia night,
Oh,
but
no way.
I did. It's probably because 'cause I'm part of, like, the cabal, right?
Oh,
But
yeah. Mhm. I
for
knew that.
sure. But, I could tell where he was going, and I just asked him questions, and I let him talk for, like, an hour. And, because I don't mind spending an hour trying to figure out where he was coming from, and we had a very civil conversation. I think I did scare him a little when I did tell him that I used to hang out, but I let him talk, for, like, an hour before I said that, and then I said,
Yeah.
I was like, when I lived in DC, I used to go there. I'm like, and I never saw like the basement or the stairs or the hidden children or like so I'm like, what do you think about that? So but I would like I said, took me an hour to get there. And
Mm.
um I'm not confident that I changed his mind in one conversation, but it was not contentious. It didn't break down. Right? He was
Yeah.
still my neighbor. We still waved at each other and everything was fine. And if I had the opportunity to have many conversations with him and hadn't moved from West LA, I don't know what would have happened, but it definitely wasn't contentious at all.
And I think, I definitely there's been times where I chose to have those conversations and times when I chose not to have the conversations. And as you mentioned, you don't have to have these conversations with every single person, depending on how you feel safe or not safe to do that, depending on how you feel that connection is or is not part of what you want to have in your life. I know that you take it on as a political activism on your part to have as many conversations as possible with people. Whereas I am more of a reserved person. I don't really like talking to strangers unless I'm in a podium or in front of a classroom, right? I reserve I guess maybe I'm more of an introvert in that way. But I do remember one time I was taking the Amtrak from LA to the Bay Area, I believe, and I sat next to this older white man. And we were just having a conversation about how's your day? What are you doing? Blah, 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 things like that. And I remember at one point he told me that I sounded so articulate, which, a lot of people have
Oh
these
yeah.
things told to them if you're a person of color. And then I said, "Yeah, I have a PhD. I hope I am." And he was just so shocked and surprised. And he said, "What do you mean?" And then he just asked me randomly, "Can I ask you a question and you won't take offense?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Is English your first language?" And I said, "No." And then he was even more surprised, and he had 1,000 questions about it. He was like, "This topic comes up in my family all the time, where tons of people believe in my family that if you are bilingual, you're less smart or less educated, or that you're not gonna be as successful in school." And now here I am. I'm meeting someone who is the opposite of that. And then I chose to have a conversation with him that lasted like a long time about this topic. It made me so uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because of the how that conversation started. You're so articulate. And then, well, I mean, not only was I stuck there because that was my assigned seat, but but I did consciously engage in that conversation. And it made me think, one, people are so insulated. Like I know our podcast is called IntraCultural podcast, but people are very insular in how they think and political views, cultural assumptions that they don't even know what to ask or what not to ask when they step out of that comfort zone. And again, this runs counter to so many political activist approaches of like call out culture and being very direct and assertive, but sometimes just listening in the right context, and with the right, caveats in place that you feel safe and you feel it is going to push your boundaries, but it's not it is what is discomfort, not danger.
Discomfort, not danger. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. You say that too all the time. It is discomfort, not danger, that we just talk and care about what the other person has to say, even if it is some random stranger. But hopefully, if it's your family, you care about what they have to say.
Yeah, and I think there are two important points there. One is that I know for myself that, I wouldn't have gotten to a place where I could be a DEIB specialist, right? Like, if I hadn't had teachers and people who were willing to have those conversations with me, because that's, it's basically, right, what is the goal of your conversation, right? Is the goal of your conversation to win this political fight, right? If the goal of your conversation is to actually like attempt to educate someone or attempt to give them a counter example, then you need to take a different approach to the political conversations you're having, because otherwise you're just going to basically reinscribe this idea that we're very different and we can't communicate, and then we're all going to go back to our corners, which increases polarization in the country. But, I will give the caveat that this also doesn't mean that there isn't a place for people to kind of like scream into the abyss, right? And to like tell people to, that to make their voice heard in a different way. But if your goal is if you're in a space where it's just uncomfortable and not dangerous, if you have the mental and emotional energy to do it, right? Then taking this approach actually is a step towards alleviating some of that polarization and right making a connection across potential difference rather than reinscribing that difference. But
Mhm.
there's a time and a place for it.
And I think, what you said too about, are you getting into the conversation to win an argument? Or are you getting into it to understand? So many times we get into conversations with our partners, our parents, our family, anyone, even at work, to just win. And we can't show up to win. If we're trying to create meaningful connections, we can't try to win every time. We have to seek to understand and have that growth oriented perspective. It doesn't mean that they're going to change your mind. It doesn't mean that you're gonna change their mind. I know, shockingly, that's not the goal. The goal is to try to understand a little bit more, and maybe the answer is not, "You vote this way, you vote that way," but now you create, like, some new insight that wouldn't have been anticipated that can inform a different kind of conversation,
Yep.
and it's not, we don't have to have the solutions to everything today. This is all a work in progress, and it is important to take it day by day and step by step and have
Absolutely.
these conversations often and regularly.
Hmm. And I will say that, my goal usually is to eventually change someone's mind, right? That is my,
Mhm,
but it's a long-term goal. And understanding them has to come first because it's
mhm,
just otherwise it's not going to happen. But I do have that goal and it's okay to have that goal too. But the initial goal should be I want to understand where you're coming from. I want to understand your worldview. I want to understand your baseline assumptions. Otherwise, we're simply just hey, othering people and saying, "Well,
mhm,
you're not like me, and so you're not worth listening to." And
mhm.
that's really problematic.
Yeah, I guess I should say that too. Yeah, it is depending on what the context is. Are you trying to change your mind because, you feel really passionate about your political position? That to have that position. In I think in, even when you come in, and I'm just thinking of something recently about things like just a family conversation about spending money, how you spend money and how you don't spend money, because those things are also very charged, right? Uh and I have come into that conversation to change someone else's opinion. And then after having that conversation, I kid you not, for 4 months, my opinion changed. And I
Right.
was like, "Dang it."
Mhm.
How did that happen? It
Mhm.
took 4 months, but they Uno reversed me, and now I feel different about that point, and I mean, they feel different about it too, and that, having that conversation consistently and trying to understand the point of view might surprise you in where you end up.
Yeah, for sure. And, that's it's important to just be aware of what your goals are, right? To actively position yourself to be a listener and to listen for those points of commonality and just be open to hearing what people have to say. So I want to make a couple of points. So that means that all of the discourse around agree to disagree is unhelpful, right?
Mhm,
And doesn't actually work. And I think that's really important to note because I see so many, right, civil discourse kinds of guidebooks that are like, well, just, find something you have in common and then just be like, okay, well, we just agree to disagree. But
I
you
hate it.
actually, no, you, I hate
I
it.
really hate it.
It's so not helpful. So not
No.
helpful. The other set of kind of guides that I see is like don't use the language of the opposition, right? Because you're perpetuating it.
Hmm.
And I think that, that sometimes turns us off to hearing the kinds of framing and language that somebody that has a different view than you uses. Sometimes you need to be able to use that as a wedge to actually, right, make a connection in order to have a conversation. So I think it doesn't mean you're perpetuating this kind of messaging or framing if you're in a one-on-one conversation with someone who might like reject you if you're using a different set of right language or framing as well. So
Yeah.
those are two pieces of advice that I see circulate so broadly that I think are not actually getting us where we need to be.
Can I add one more?
Yeah.
The calling out. Like,
Yeah.
I hate that so much. I know that makes me a really bad activist. I know. But calling people out doesn't help. It just silences people. It makes people afraid to speak up. And then you didn't change their mind. They just don't feel safe around you anymore.
Hmm.
And that is if we can get rid of the call out culture. I know I've heard like calling in. I like that. That's a little better. Um, but seeking to really understand people. And again, like it doesn't have to be everyone, right? There are literally unsafe people that need to figure their things out and stop talking. I'm sure that is the case. Just stop creating harm. But it we can't just assume that everyone is a bad actor.
Yeah.
And if we do that, then we really are shooting ourselves in the foot and not making progress towards our intention, which is to create a more civil, more, not the white version civil, but the
No, we are not the white version. No,
not
no.
the white version, whatever that version would be, but not that one. Uh, a more, integrated, more peaceful, more respectful, more understanding, more accepting, inclusive kind of society. And it
Yeah.
all starts with how we relate to the people that we care about.
It does. And if you want to have a functional pluralistic democracy, then I'm sorry, everyone, have that conversation with your cousin at dinner and talk about the monsters and talk about the fangs and, um, you know, one or two conversations, or if you target one or two, people in your life that you think you might be able to have those conversations with, then that's one or two people. And you don't have to be me. You don't have to like seek people out and have long conversations about Pizzagate, right? I'm totally willing to do that every time.
Yeah, call Missy. She has their contact info
That's right. Call
available
me.
online.
I will pop in and have every difficult conversation for you. I am totally up for it. But if you can just right, move in small ways for with a few people, then that's going to create a more inclusive society overall, better relationships, and oh my goodness, something we need so much, a more functional democratic system.
So going back to Monster Has Fangs, let's say now someone at my dinner table told me this and they are 25 years old. My answer would be like, hmm, what can you say more about that? What monster are we talking about here? And just if they want to have a conversation about fangs and I still don't believe that there's monsters, entertain the conversation and see where it goes. I think that's what I would do.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, it only took me like 20 minutes to change your mind. I feel good.
It didn't take 4 months, which, this happened most recently. So at least I'll let them know to contact you for tips and tricks on
Oh,
how to
yes.
change my mind faster.
Please, please. Perfect. Um, so I think that is a good conversation that hopefully helps you all answer the question, how do I talk to my cousin at dinner if they have different political views? And helps you build some better relationships. So how about I wrap
Yeah.
um, the inaugural episode of the Intracultural podcast. and say thank you for tuning in and thank you for listening. And we'll be back in a week or two with another burning question for you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoyed it. See you soon.